Hello and welcome to this video on section 6.4, truth tables for arguments. In this video we're going to symbolize or formalize arguments. And that means that we're going to go from content, that is language, words, into form. And form is another way of saying abstract symbolization. And so we're going to, in a sense, translate this argument into a formal or symbolized representation. Okay, so we have this argument here. If Maria graduated from Harvard, then she must be a pretty smart girl. Maria did in fact graduate from Harvard. It must be the case that Maria is a pretty smart girl. Okay, notice that the conclusion here is that Maria is a pretty smart girl. And we know that because the premises are supporting that, and those are the first two statements. And we have the indicator phrase here, it must be the case. Okay, so we need to figure out a way to symbolize the premises. The first premise is if Maria graduated from Harvard, then she must be a pretty smart girl. Okay, notice that that first premise is a conditional statement, right? It's an if-then statement. Remember that conditional statements have parts, they have an antecedent, and they have a consequent. So the question here is, what is the antecedent? Well, it's Maria graduated from Harvard, right? So we need to symbolize that antecedent, and we could do so by using H. So here we have the symbolized antecedent as H. So H will represent Maria graduated from Harvard. Okay, now we need to symbolize the consequent. Well, the consequent is that she must be a pretty smart girl, right? Well, all we have to do is choose another letter to symbolize that whole consequent, which remember is a proposition. And the whole thing, the if-then, is a complex proposition, right? But that consequent is a proposition all on its own. And so we could use S to symbolize that she must be a pretty smart girl, right? Okay, so we have the simple statements symbolized. We have H and S. Now we need to be able to put the premises in formal terms. Well, the first premise, as we already said, is a conditional statement. It's an if-then statement. Well, basically, it's going to be if H, then S, right? Because the premise is if Maria graduated from Harvard, then Maria must be a pretty smart girl. So the correct symbolization for the first premise is if H, then S. And that's what I have here. If H, then S. That is our first premise. Okay? So all I've done is symbolize the conditional statement there. Okay, the second premise says that Maria did in fact graduate from Harvard. Okay, well that's another way of just saying Maria graduated from Harvard, right? Which is the H. So we need to have that second premise symbolized separately from the first premise being the conditional statement. And we could do that by putting an H under the first premise, right? And so that will look like that. Let me move the H over to the left. It's going to be right below, so the first premise comes first on the top. That was the conditional statement. The second premise is going to be below the first premise, and then that's basically the H. We do have the conclusion coming after that, which is it must be the case that Maria is a pretty smart girl. Well, that's basically saying that the conclusion is just S, right? That is to say Maria is a pretty smart girl. We are going to have a line like this here separating the premises from the conclusion. So in our final symbolization here, we're going to have a line separating the premises from the conclusion. And now we need to symbolize the premise. I'm sorry, the conclusion, I mean. Okay, well, if we symbolize the conclusion, we basically just need the S, right? Because we said that that's what the conclusion was. And so we basically just need to put that S below the line. And so that basically shows or represents the fact that the conclusion is its own thing, and that it follows from the two premises that are given above. So the S will be below the line. And let me put it over here, directly below the if H then S and then the H and then the S as a conclusion. So this is it. This is our final symbolization or formalization of the whole argument. We have the first premise as if H then S. We have the second premise as H. And then we have the conclusion as S. And so the conclusion will always come below the line. Okay, so that is one argument that is formalized or symbolized. Let's do one more. Okay, here we have our second argument. Let me go ahead and read it. If Stacy has a high GPA, then she will attend Stanford. Let me move that down a little bit. If Stacy has a high GPA, then she will attend Stanford. Stacy does not have a high GPA, therefore she will not attend Stanford. Okay, that is our argument. Again, we need to pick letters for the statements here. Notice that the first premise here is a conditional again. If Stacy has a high GPA, then she will attend Stanford. So we need to pick a letter for the antecedent and a letter for the consequent. Well, how about if we pick G to represent Stacy has a high GPA? Then our first premise, the antecedent for the first premise will be just that G, right? The consequent in this case is that she will attend Stanford, right? So how about we let S represent she will attend Stanford. And so if we do that, then we basically have S below the G here as representing Stacy will attend Stanford. Okay, we have our simple propositions have been symbolized. G will represent Stacy has a high GPA. S will represent Stacy will attend Stanford. Now we need to put this in purely symbolic terms. Okay, well again, the antecedent here is a conditional statement again, and basically the antecedent will be represented by if G then S, right? And so that would look like this, right? Because that is what that first premise is saying, right? If G then S, if Stacy has a high GPA, then she will attend Stanford. Okay, so that is the first premise. That is our symbolized first premise. Let's go ahead and think about what the second premise is saying. Well, the second premise is basically saying that Stacy does not have a high GPA. Well, if we think about it, that's the negation of G, right? And so that has to look like this, right? That is the negation of G. That's what it would look like. And so that's the second premise, and so we put it right after the first premise. Okay, the only thing left now is the conclusion, and so I've drawn a line there to separate the premises from the conclusion. And the conclusion says that she will not attend Stanford. Well, if we think about it, that's the negation of S, right? That's not S. And so the conclusion will have to look like this, right? Not S. Okay, here we have the final symbolized result for this second argument that we're looking at. Notice that the premises are above the line and the conclusion is below the line. Okay, so make sure that you are able to do this. Make sure that you're able to symbolize this, because your homework assignment will